Welcome, friends, to a new webinar series sponsored by our friends, Amplify Media. My name is Lisa Yaboa, and I'm going to be your host throughout this series. And this series is going to help us to navigate this interesting place that we find ourselves in history. Many of us anticipated that 2020 was going to be a difficult year because we are in an election year, but none of us could have anticipated the layers of complexity that we find ourselves in addition to being in an election year, of us journeying through a global worldwide pandemic, facing economic concerns, the fact that we are having to reckon with this inflection point, to sit with how racial injustice has been kind of like unveiled in some new ways for many of us. We find ourselves in an incredibly divisive time. It feels as though the world is quite noisy, and we're caught off guard, I think, this year, as many of us have been living in this interesting place. And so as church leaders, as folks who are trying to make sense of what is happening in the world and this very divisive culture within our faith communities, I think there are two major questions that we find ourselves asking ourselves over and over again. The first one is, how do we navigate these divisive waters and end up on the side of justice? I think the second question is, how do we hold space for multiple views without holding space for harm? I think that's the question I tend to be most curious about as I hold lots of realities within a church community. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this series called Justice, Love, Humility, Pastoring a Divided Culture. I am so excited to introduce to you two very special guests that we have with us today, leading writers and also researchers in religion and culture, Diana Butler Bass and Robert P. Jones. I want to share a little bit about both of these wonderful guests. Diana Butler Bass is an author, speaker, and independent scholar specializing in American religion and culture. She holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke University, the holiest of all places, and is the award-winning author of 10 books, including her latest book, Grateful: The Transformative Power of Giving Thanks. Welcome, Diana.
Hey, it's good to be with you. I know you said to say a couple other words about what we were doing, and I just sent in the first draft of my next book, which is a book called Freeing Jesus. And it's amazing that having written now, 10 books, this is the 11th, that I've never written about Jesus. And so it was a really interesting and fun project to be doing, especially at this moment. It was not about politics directly, and it was not about COVID, but instead it was a piece in tracking through experience and memoir and how our views of Jesus are really shaped out of the journeys that we take as people. And so it was a great project. So I've been working on that, and I've also been during these months of the pandemic building up a new newsletter via Substack, and I've been really enjoying that, connecting with my readers twice a week, and kind of getting used to this new platform that's out there for writers to connect with readers, and trying to build a community around ideas that help to heal where we are right now in the culture. So I've been doing a lot of writing.
During this time, yeah.
During this time, yes, because of course I can't do the things that I normally love to do, and that is teaching in churches and giving lectures in colleges and universities. I mean, I am doing some of that, but that's all via Zoom.
Merry Christmas. Diana, we're so grateful to have you with us. I also want to introduce our second guest, Robert P. Jones, who is the CEO and founder of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. That's a whole lot to say. And a leading commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, and his latest book is White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy Supremacy in American Christianity, which I'm adding to my list of books to read. Welcome, Robbie. We're so grateful to have you.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad to be here, and glad to be here with you, and also thrilled to be here with Diana. Diana and I have known each other for, we were just saying, like more than a dozen years, in various capacities. And I want to say I'm grateful for Grateful. That book came, just as, I think the world felt like it was turning upside down for many folks, and I think I've come back to it during this, during the pandemic mode. So I thank you for that word of gratitude. I see give thanks behind your head there in your well curated space behind you. But I think that's been a really important, word for us in these moments where it feels hard to find anything to hang on to, that things just feel tough and hard and heavy. So kind of finding those places and those moments of gratitude, I think, have been super important for all of our mental and spiritual health over these months. And so I think that's also part of the conversation we're having today is, how do we, when we feel fatigued, when we feel heavy, when we feel, like things are just so daunting out there, how do we still, walk the walk? How do we still remain faithful? How do we still stand up for justice, even in all of those contexts? I think it's really difficult. On my end, I've been figuring out how to do a new release book tour in the middle of all of this craziness, which normally, you're out on the road, you're kind of speaking places, you're meeting people and all of that. And so trying to put all that together. And I think in many ways, missing that human connection that comes. These little boxes are great. And, we were saying they're better than not having the little boxes to talk to each other in, but they're certainly not the same as actual human connection. And then looking ahead, we're a week away at PRRI from releasing our Fall American Values Survey. It's our annual kind of religion and politics survey. So I am up to my eyeballs in politics, right now, kind of thinking about that and kind of how everything you've just named, Lisa, is shaping the election, shaping where religious people are and people of faith are kind of, heading into the election. So, feeling a bit kind of overwhelmed by trying to figure out, so where do we look to kind of know what's going on? We've got the world's on fire, it's underwater. There's protests around racial justice and the issue. There's flare-ups again of the pandemic. And we are in a really trying time. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, I do think, I have a seminary degree, but have not been ordained and have never actually served as a local congregational pastor. But I don't think there's, in my lifetime, perhaps been a more important time to be serving in local congregations. I mean, that really is where the transformation is going to happen. If we get it, it's going to come from below and not from above.
I'm just grateful for both of you and just the ways in which you are holding space in your vocations and helping us, hopefully as pastors and people who are kind of on the front lines in a different way with our church communities, to be faithful and to also help to create and cultivate faithfulness in others. So, what's interesting about me is that I was actually born on an inauguration day. I was born January 20th, 1977. It was Jimmy Carter's inauguration. And so, I can maybe say that throughout my life, political election years have always been, or presidential election years have always been tense. But there is something about these last 4 years, and as we find ourselves right now facing another election, that it doesn't feel like how it has before, where things kind of go back to normal. Like, there's a kind of a little bit of a spike, but then, we're like, well, we'll live out these 4 years, but this feels very different. It feels incredibly like a heightened sense of awareness around this election cycle. Will you both talk a little bit more about how we reached this point of tribalism and division? I mean, people have their political teams, but it feels different now.
I love that you were born on an inauguration day. I was actually born in 1959. And so the first year of my life, my mother was a campaign worker for the Kennedy campaign. And so she tells a great story about how one of my very first words was saying Kendi, from the stroller while she was handing out literature. So politics and religion is something that I was born into as well, having that really early experience through my parents. My training is in history. A lot of people think of me more in terms of religion and culture, which is a little bit more towards sociology of religion, but my academic background is the methods and how to think about the past. And so when someone asked me a question about, how we got to where we are, I both think about recent events like Robbie does, and then I think of further distant ones as well. And there are a couple of things that I can compare this to. One is the election of FDR, which was contentious, and it wasn't really solved. It continued to be contentious into his first term in some very significant ways, where there were attempts to block legislation. There were arguments about how the government could actually address the Depression. He did not have an easy path, and Americans were divided. And I think that a lot of that division, came out of the fact that people were suffering so much. And so we might think that during times when people are wondering where their next meal is coming from, they will be less involved in politics. But the truth of the matter, I think, is historically, is that the more politics has a direct impact on people's lives, the more they argue about it. And so that example from the early part of the 20th century, I think is still pretty lively, and it's very relevant because, of course, the economic crisis that we're going through right now. And the other one, of course, is the Civil War. You talk about tribalism and divided churches, and the whole period of the 1850s was a period of increasing divides in individual congregations and in denominations, to the point of splits in denominations around issues with slavery. And of course, those things were not solved with the election of Abraham Lincoln. As a matter of fact, it was that election that forced the issue so strongly that the South then broke off and founded the Confederacy. And so there are a couple points in history where where issues, and it almost seems to be around issues of race and economics, that really push division forward. And so I think of those longer term examples, and part of my rationale for bringing those up here at the beginning is it's very easy for us to stand in a moment and say, we're never going to get through this. This is completely unique. And it is, of course, unique historically, and it's because it's never been 2020 before. But people in this country have been through things somewhat like this in the past. And we have managed to put the pieces together, and we also have managed to create more stable political environments out of deeply tribalistic and divided ones. And so I just want to start with that word of sort of historical hope.
That's helpful. Robbie, what about you?
Yeah, that's super helpful, I think. And going back, and I want to pick up just on a couple of themes here: the tribalism and the fact that some of the reasons why we are still wrestling, for example, with the racial problems that we're wrestling today, is exactly what Diana said: is that we never really solved them, right? So they get pushed down, I think, in many ways, but then they come back because they are, I should say, they maybe only get partially solved, right? But the root of it doesn't really get addressed, right? So we get legislation, that, ensures voting rights, or we get civil rights, legislation that does away with some of the most overt things like the Jim Crow laws and segregated water fountains and segregated schools and those kinds of things. So those things get pushed down and go away, but we never really deal with the underlying issue. And one of the reasons why I made sure that I put the word white supremacy in the title of the most recent book, and the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, is because that's the thing that we have let live, I think, throughout. So, I was really struck by going back and reading like Frederick Douglass right after the Civil War, right? So before and after the Civil War. And one of the biggest things that Frederick Douglass is disillusioned about after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery is that whites across North and South, and white Christians across Northern and Southern lines, so quickly come together. And one of the reasons why they're able to come together is they actually still share this framework of white supremacy. That is that while they were on different sides of the slavery question, they were not on different sides of the white supremacy question. And that actually lived in, to the 20th century. And I thought I'd also bring up that kind of one thing I wanted to bring back from the past is actually a little quote I'm going to read from H. Richard Niebuhr from this great piece that he wrote it's almost 100 years ago now. So it was 1929. The book was called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. And it's remarkable. I kind of talking about kind of the eternal return of these problems that we just don't fully deal with. We kind of push them down and then they come back. And that's kind of where we are. So I'll read this little bit, and I kind of remember, again, this is like nearly 100 years ago. He's talking about denominationalism and these factions in the Christian church. He says, these are an unacknowledged hypocrisy. It represents the accommodation of Christianity to the caste system of human society. The division of the churches closely follows the division of men into the castes of national, racial, and economic groups. It draws the color line in the Church of God. It fosters the misunderstandings, the self-exaltations, the hatreds of jingoistic nationalism by counting in the body of Christ the spurious differences of provincial loyalties. It sets the rich and poor apart at the table of the Lord, where the fortunate may enjoy the bounty they have provided, while the others feed upon the crust their poverty affords. And, how remarkable those words ring today. I mean, we've got a new book out, right? Isabel Wilkerson, called Caste, that's at the top of the bestseller list. And all these books on racial justice, have been at the top of the bestseller list this year. And it is, I mean, in many ways, it is the, Jim Wallace has called it, and others have called it our original sin, that we have not really ever fully dealt with. So, and I think today that one last point, the tribalism piece, is because what has happened in our politics is that partisanship has become welded onto religious and racial identity, right? And so now you've got partisan identity, racial identity, religious identity, all things that people feel these very visceral attachments to, all kind of pulling in the same direction and really just pulling us apart.
Yeah. This is good. I think it's so helpful that you've kind of both anchored us in historical moments so that we don't get this idea that we just kind of stumbled into 2020, like, oh gosh, it just got real bad this year. I oftentimes say that the two major diseases of the American context are nostalgia and amnesia. It's like we don't know how to connect our dots, to correct our dots. It's just like we just think things kind of come out of nowhere, and yet we are connected to stories and people. We're also connected to myth, which can sometimes then dictate the ways in which we live out our lives. Robbie, you're kind of help transition us to this second question, which is, where have churches typically stood in these moments of division, and how has 2020 been different, or is it different?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in quickly. I mean, I think this quote I just read from Niebuhr gives you some clue about where churches have stood, historically. I mean, I think churches, is like other human institutions, I think, have more often than not reflected the society in which they live, rather than, transforming the society in which they live. And, one of the remarkable things about, the patterns in the religious landscape, if you look at the kind of electorally speaking, is that it's fairly accurate if you ask in the modern era, like let's say since Reagan, what does the religious voting landscape look like? You can kind of boil it down to this, and it is that white Christian groups, that is white evangelicals and white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, have tended to vote majorities for Republican presidential candidates. And pretty much everybody else has tended to vote majority for Democratic candidates. So Christians of color, African-American, Protestants, Latino Catholics, the religiously unaffiliated, Muslim Americans, and other like Buddhists, Jews, other non-Christian religions, all tend to lean toward Democratic candidates. And there's a way in which, again, like Niebuhr, if we step back and look at that and ask from like a Christian point of view, like that ought to be a scandal, right? That this pattern is so consistently there, and the things that divide Christians are exactly the same things that divide the rest of the country, right? So you've got white and black. There's no more distance in the religious landscape than white evangelical Protestants on the one hand and African American Protestants on the other. I mean, we had in the last election, we had 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump, and we had more than 9 in 10 African American Protestants voting for Hillary Clinton. I mean, you can't get further on the, further off the spectrum there. And yet, I think there's not that much hand wringing, or people aren't as aghast as, I think, because we're so accustomed to it. We're not as aghast as we are, and haven't asked, well, like, what the hell? Like, why is that?
Yeah, like what's underneath
like, why
this?
should that be? Like, it's one of those things. If you had like the anthropologists from Mars, coming down to observe the American religious landscape and look at voting, I mean, they would be utterly perplexed, at that division, and asking ourselves, like, what's there and why is that? And the only real answer for that, really, historically, is we get these patterns today with white Christians leaning toward Republican candidates and Christians of color leaning the other direction as a direct result of the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s. Prior to that, we would talk about the solid Democratic South. Whites in the South were Democrats. And we literally had white Christian flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party exactly over the Democratic Party support for civil rights. That too ought to be kind of a scandal, I think, when we really think about that trajectory and that history. So the fact that we're dug in over racial justice issues and immigration, for example, which are all about who gets to really be an American, right? That's what it's really about at the end of the day. We have these divisions, and they have their roots in the Civil War. They have their roots in Reconstruction. They have their roots in the Civil Rights movement in the 1960s. And again, issues we've just never really resolved, and that continue. And if anything, I think have picked up momentum in the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Robbie, that's such a rich answer. And what I'd like to do is just kind of follow through on a couple of different points that you both made. And that is, churches and division, where does this come from, and how do we get this? I think it's really important to remember that churches in the United States are institutions inside of a contested democracy. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very different setting for church than, say, European state churches or countries in Africa, which might not have contested democracy, that they're, maybe a strong man is running a government and the churches have to exist in a different relationship to the government. But here in the United States, you have a contested democracy, and churches exist within that. And that means that churches since the beginning of the Republic have always followed the paths of least resistance in a popular setting. And so we have had this tendency in the United States to equate success in religion with big numbers, going back to George Whitfield and the First Great Awakening. So Whitfield's proponents were saying, well, the First Great Awakening must be true because look, 10,000 people showed up in this field outside of Philadelphia to hear George Whitfield preach. And George Whitfield himself would brag about the numbers. And then people would say that this particular denomination was right because look at how it was growing. So we have this weird metric in the United States regarding religion that's always related to how big and how rich a religious group is. And so that means that especially dominant religious groups that have happened to be the biggest and the richest, that serve the largest part of the population, are always going to be following the path of least resistance in order to guarantee their power. That is, they're going to try to keep their numbers high, and they're going to try to keep the money flowing in. And so understanding, I think, that piece of American religion is incredibly significant. Now, what that has to do, say, with racial justice, which I think is really important for this conversation. For several years, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee. And and I was a stranger. I only lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, and then I wound up in Memphis teaching at a college. And so it was a completely different cultural context to me. It was in certain ways baffling. I was a little like a sociologist from Mars that had been dropped down in the Mid-South and was trying to make sense of this. And I also happened to be an Episcopalian. And so it was very intriguing as to which churches in Memphis, which churches were big and successful. And what was true about the white churches in Memphis, especially the mainline white churches, Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, is that all of the churches now that were the largest churches in Memphis, Tennessee, were the churches that had the least to say about the civil rights movement. They were the ones that capitulated in some way, shape, or form to the surrounding culture in order to protect their numbers and their money at the time of the civil rights movement. And there were also a couple other Episcopal churches in Memphis that were white churches, historically white churches. And all of those churches were teeny tiny and almost ready to close. And when I was doing research in that diocese and looking at those histories of the churches, those were the churches that stood up for Black people during the civil rights movement. And so what had happened literally in Memphis is that the white churches that had sided with Dr. King and with the activists in Memphis about the civil rights movement, those churches had nearly all disappeared by the time I lived there at the turn of the 21st century. And the churches that, had done nothing were the big successful churches. Now, that is a little sort of, I think, miniature piece of American religious history. But I also think it's a pretty telling piece. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be extrapolated into a mythology. Mm-hmm. And the mythology, and Robbie, this is where Robbie will be on sure footing, because I know that we have agreed on this for a very long time. And that is the mythology of that kind of success in numbers, particularly when it comes to diluting the messages of justice and the messages of equality in God and the message of prophetic preaching. That was captured in a book in 1972 by a guy named Dean Kelly. And that book was called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. Why Conservative Churches Grow. Now, the book itself was written by a pretty good sociologist who was actually a liberal Methodist. And I think in certain ways, nobody ever actually read the book. All they ever did was read the title, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing. And what people did in white churches across the United States was to see that title, and they read it in their brain as only conservative churches can grow. And so since 1972, there has been this idea floating around in white church communities that if you are liberal if you're in favor of social justice, and if you are a prophetic preaching congregation, your congregation will die.
Mhm.
And then they hold up examples such as that, what happened in Memphis, and say, oh, you know, this is pretty obvious. If you speak out about these issues, your church is going to go into decline.
Mhm.
And that is the one thing right now that is utterly, completely terrifying
Mhm.
to white people whose denominations are currently in numerical decline.
Mhm.
And so what has happened is that there's been this sociological mythology that was invented by the title of this book so long ago now, that has stuck into the minds of white church leaders, exacerbated by what they feel like are actually living examples of the problem,
Mhm.
combined with the institutional tendency to just take the path of least resistance through whatever in order to gain the most adherence. And that, I think that gives us a pretty good picture of what has happened, I think, in mainline churches.
Mhm.
Is literally people are terrified, even people with really good hearts and who would agree with everything that any of the three of us would say about social justice issues. They'll stand back and they'll say, yeah, I've tried to do that with my church, but every time I do, somebody threatens to leave. Or
Mhm.
there's even major denominations right now where the people who are the heads of denominations have told their pastors that they're not allowed to address certain issues in certain ways for fear of running folks off of the church. And that piece in white churches, the need to maintain that power and privilege, the need to maintain its wealth, plays into this mythology. And I think just a kind of they're incapable in certain ways to break through that. Now, individual congregations do break through. There are very brave individual congregations. But I think that the overall prospectus, until people are very honest about this history and how they understand what success is, I think that the main line, at least, is going to continue to let this stuff slide by, because letting it slide by until the moment passes, until it's quiet again, is really the path of least resistance and the path of what people think is the greatest growth.
Mm-hmm. You know, I have a kind of an interesting, I live in an interesting place in that, you know, I am a pastor, but I also like to call myself a parish priest. I have great connections with the folks at the CrossFit gym, great, you know, with, you know, restaurateurs. I love my community deeply. And what we're talking about across the board with, you know, whether it be mainline denominations or evangelical denominations, and sometimes the ways in which they don't lean into being very brave to talk about racial injustice or other social issues or other systems of oppression, to my friends who are unaffiliated, to my friends who are not necessarily in church, they would not say that's what makes a healthy church community, to shy away. You know, but both of you as researchers, how does a church's, you know, perceived stance on racism and other injustices affect their growth and also their health? And is there a word you would share to churches about how they are perceived by those who may not already be in the pews?
I'll just kind of finish up my thought real quickly and then turn over to Robbie there. I think that the first thing is to separate the idea of growth from health.
Mm-hmm.
You know, growth can come, growth means just adding bodies to a building or putting up new buildings on a physical plant that's a church. And that does not mean anything about the health of an institution. And so I've often thought back to Memphis, and I've wondered, you know, about the decisions that those people made in the 50s. And you know, their churches might now not exist in any significant way. You know, they might be churches of 20 people, but you know what? They were churches that did the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's what health in a church, the metric of health in a church always should be. Did we follow the teachings of Jesus? Did we live out the life of the Beatitudes? Did we love our neighbors as ourselves? And you can do all of that. And what we know, again, from the history of the church is that you can do all of that, and you can actually wind up, say, in the Middle Ages, with a church inquisition arresting you and putting you on trial for heresy. And you are the one who winds up in jail or hanged as a heretic. But you know what? Those are the people who are remembered. It's the people who have done the right thing that become the saints and the heroes of faith. And eventually we look back on the parts of the institution and the leaders in an institution that did the wrong thing, and we say, oh, we don't want to be like them. And so the health of the church is dependent upon the church's ability to follow Jesus no matter what the cost, even if it means laying down one's life. That's the health of the church. The growth of the church is incidental or accidental compared to that. That may be such a huge witness that you wind up growing. But it can do the opposite as well. It could also mean that everybody else says, no, that's too hard, and flees. Or somewhere in between. So I think that the fundamental issue at hand for American religion is to separate those two streams. Growth does not mean health.
Yeah, let me just say an amen to that. I think that's really, really critical. And, you know, I'd say that I don't know about you, Diana, but like when I was in seminary, which is a little bit later than you, but not much, I remember in my Southern Baptist seminary, I mean, there was whole courses on church growth, right? That was like that phrase, the church growth movement was like a big thing in the 1990s. And, you know, a lot, but the truth of the matter is, if you look at, and they would do things like demographic analysis of the neighborhood to see like whether it would support a church, right? But and the truth of that, if you really paid attention to what that was advocating, most of those strategies were white supremacist, white flight strategies, right? You follow white people out of the cities into the suburbs, you find out where the kind of wealthier suburbs are, you hang out a shingle, and goodness, guess what? You can grow a church in that climate, right? As long as you don't really offend anyone and you sort of like, you know, take, as you said, the path of least resistance. And those churches can get huge, right? Because they're plotted down in what used to be cow fields, right? Where there's no civic infrastructure. So they're providing all the civic infrastructure from Weight Watchers to what the YMCA would do in the city to, you know, I mean, they're doing all coffee shops, bookstores, you name it, right, are all kind of in these big, you know, mega church plants. But I think whether that has anything to do with faithfulness or, you know, or health, I think is a very different thing. And I think, again, I mean, a lot of those growth strategies have been really about providing places where many of these assumptions about white supremacy could go completely unchallenged. I mean, I've thought so much about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail in these last days, you know, where he's writing in that piece, not to the extremists who are burning crosses and you know, throwing bricks and spitting on people. He's writing to the upstanding pillars, civic leaders, right? Kind of the tall steeple churches and synagogues of Birmingham. I mean, the respectable religious leaders, you know, and he has this line in there that's just a heartbreaking line where, you know, he's writing with kind of dismay, like, well, who are all these Christians, right? In these pretty buildings. And then he has this little phrase, sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows. Like just this devastating phrase, right? And I would say, you know, for my, you know, I didn't grow up in a mega church. I grew up in a very, you know, modest sized church in Jackson, Mississippi, but I can definitely say, and we were short on stained glass windows, but the image, I think, is still there that, you know, I think for the most part, what my faith did for me was give me a very solid sense of safety and kind of being kind of protected in this kind of, you know, loving cocoon while completely anesthetizing my conscience to anything about racial justice, civil rights. I mean, I was in elementary school and the first Black kid showed up at my public school. And our church had not one syllable to say about that, like to even help us understand what was happening. Like there was literally no discussion about that at all. I went to a high school who, and almost my entire youth group went to a high school that was public school, whose mascot was Colonel Reb, right? And when our football team scored a touchdown, and by the way, our 2/3 African American football team scored a touchdown, the mostly white band played Dixie, and a white cheerleader ran up and down the sidelines with a big Confederate flag. And our church had not one little thing to say about that, or even to help us even bring that even to our consciousness, right? That was something we ought to be thinking about, how that might affect our Black classmates there. I mean, so it's the power, I think, of this kind of, blunting, anesthetizing, blinding function that I think white Christian theology and churches have played, making us feel fine about ourselves and indifferent to the world outside of ourselves, has been one of the biggest traits. One last thing and I think evidence of the way that white supremacy still lives with us, right? That's still okay. And that we can still feel okay about ourselves while continuing to do that. The last thing I'll say, Diana, though, on the numbers front, and I don't want to kind of go there so much, because I think you're right. We shouldn't just be thinking in pragmatic terms, but even for those who want to think a little bit in pragmatic terms, it is notable that we have seen a stem over the last three years of white mainline churches have stopped the decline. I mean, they've kind of found a bottom, and in fact, in our last year's numbers, they're back up a point. So there's after decades of decline, it seems like there's been a plateau, and even the last two numbers has been a little uptick. Among white evangelicals, we continue to see the slide, right? So that actually in 2019, and this is pretty important, I think, and been largely overlooked, if you white evangelical Protestants and white mainline Protestants make up exactly the same proportion of the U.S. population today, and that is only 15%, each of them, right? And for white evangelicals, that's down from 21% just a decade ago, right? So that's a 6-point slide in 10 years. That's a lot. And in fact, the decline over the last year has been steeper among white evangelicals than it has been among the mainline. So it's worth noting that even if you took that metric, right, of conservative churches, it actually isn't the reality that we're seeing. Even if you took that to be gospel, it doesn't reflect the reality of what we're seeing in the numbers over the last 10 years.
Robbie, I've stood in rooms of church leaders and pointed those statistics out and made a comment to the effect of one of the fastest declining denominations in the United States right now is the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah.
And then I have turned around and said, and tell me that that's because they're too liberal. Yeah. And it's like, there's no way the Southern Baptist Convention is declining because it's too liberal. And so what we actually have now, and I'm so glad that you brought them up, because you know how I am anyway, I read your numbers like they're the Bible, is that what we have now is we actually have a numerical counter to the mythology.
Mm-hmm.
But yet I still hear people echo the mythology. Sure. And then I wonder to myself, what does it take to get people disconnected from this mantra that they've had for all of these decades now, that only conservative churches will grow.
And just to put a number on that, it's more than 1 million members that just the Southern Baptist Convention has lost over the last decade.
If the Episcopal Church lost 1 million members, there would be no Episcopal Church left. So people just don't think about these things terribly well, and what these numbers actually do mean. And just as we're finishing up this section on numbers, the other piece I want to make sure that we point out is that When we're talking about numbers of white Christians and following the paths of least resistance and the church growth strategies of the 80s and 90s, which was a great thing to bring up, Robbie, there are very successful mega churches in the United States that are either Hispanic or Black, and sometimes both Black and brown together. And it is a different thing when a minority community forms a large congregation than it is when you have these massive white congregations across the land. And it's because, you know, the white congregations are following that path of least resistance, of reifying the cultural norms of white supremacy, of economic inequality, of all these different kinds of things. Whereas congregations that emerge as large congregations out of minority communities are often doing so out of a sense of need for safety and power in numbers. And so if you are a minority community in a particular, you know, region or setting, and your church happens to grow and be large and robust, well, that is a place where you can actually go to feel safer, to gain a sense of agency, to equip your community in leadership skills that they wouldn't get in dominantly white institutions. And so I do think that there is a need for some sophistication in thinking about numbers and thinking about mega churches and thinking about where they sit in relationship to the centers of power in culture and how they and what they serve in terms of their messages and the populations that they're serving.
This conversation, I mean, we literally could go on and on and on and on. It's like manna. But I have two last questions for us. When the world gets really loud and everyone is trying to take the microphone, I think pastors have a particular voice in the midst of that. But many pastors are criticized if their sermons are political or get political. And they're also sometimes criticized if they don't speak into an inflection point in history, or they don't speak about current issues. What advice do you have for pastors when they're preaching and teaching in 2020? And specifically, I think around these topics that that sometimes have been bathed in white supremacy.
Well, I'll say a couple of words. I think, you know, the first thing I can say is that we have to tell the truth. Like, I just want to start there. You know, the one of the reasons why we are where we are is because we, and by we I mean white Christians in particular, are kind of we have not told the truth, and we've covered up the truth, and the truth is going to keep trying to find us, right, until we tell it. And so I think that's the first thing we have to say, is that I think we just have to tell the truth here. And if we're thinking, even if we're thinking about reconciliation and healing, that's not going to come until you know, this truth, you know, comes. That, you know, I've read a lot of James Baldwin, you know, for kind of working on this book, and you know, in some ways, he kept waiting, right, for white Americans and white Christians in particular, to, as King did, you know, to kind of stand up on the side of civil rights and the side of racial justice, that just never really came in mass. I mean, we had little congregations here and there and leaders here and there, but the mass of white Christians and denominations never made it there. Just as a quick aside, I do think, I'll say this, that I think particularly many of us like to think back to the civil rights movement, and I think like to think even counter to historical fact, that had we been there then, we would be on the right side of history, right? And so we will, during Black History Month, we'll talk about Martin Luther King, and, you know, we'll play the "I Have a Dream" speech, and we'll do some Bible study around that, not realizing what it would have cost us to have stood up then, right? And that's easy to do now, and there's no real political cost to that. But I think the truth of the matter is, what we're doing right now is what we would have done then. And so I think if we take that seriously, that's important. The other thing I would say is that I think the reason why we don't stand up is, and don't speak out beyond the kind of obvious just worries about the kind of pragmatic fallout, is there is this kind of sense of protectionism, right? We want to protect our church's heritage, we want to protect our church's history, we want to protect the founders of the church, we want to protect the founders of the denomination. But I think we do that by mortgaging our children's future. And I think one way of thinking about this is we can protect our ancestors or we can protect our children, but we probably can't do both. And so let's figure out how we do right by our kids and our grandchildren, right, by setting things straight, and let that be the work of our generation to kind of winnow out finally, these vestiges of white supremacy that are still in the DNA of our theology and our practices. Like that's real work. I mean, that's real work to look back and think that's something I accomplished, right? That was costly. And the last thing I'll say is that I've kind of become convinced that anytime the word political is used as a derogatory adjective in white Christian settings, you should look for the presence of white supremacy. That it is a trigger word, right? That means I'm uncomfortable. And I don't like that because it scares me, or it really makes me at unease. But that cognitive dissonance is the only way we're going to get anywhere, right? If we can sit with that long enough. And it's a gift, I would say. It is a gift to give your congregation that cognitive dissonance that can create the space for the Spirit to do some work, to speak theologically on this point. It's not doing damage to them. Like, it in fact is a gift to give them something that's going to make them wrestle, with these issues. I'll close with one thing from a case study I did in these two churches in Macon. There was a man at the predominantly white church. They were planning this joint trip between a black church and a white church to go to Montgomery to see the National Memorial for Peace and Healing, which is the memorial to the victims of lynching. So it's a pretty tough, heavy place to go visit, particularly with a kind of interracial group to go and see. And there's a prominent member of the predominantly white church who everyone expected to go and had not signed up. And finally, people said, well, look, you've been part of these conversations. Why are you not going? And he finally ended up signing up to go. And in the post-event reflection, he said, look, I'm just going to lay it out here. The reason I hemmed and hawed and almost, I realized that my fear and my hope were actually the same. And that is that I would feel responsible if I went on this trip. Right. And so I think that we're caught in many ways between this fear and this hope. And they're actually the same thing for many white Christians, I think, of goodwill, at least. It's scary, right, to know that we're responsible and that we have to actually take that seriously. But I do think that those are things that it's hard for individuals to come to on their own, but that pastoral leadership done right and well can really shepherd people into a place. And again, this is into a better place of spiritual health, right? Is really what we're talking about at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think I've been asked this question maybe 100 times in the last 6 weeks, which is actually, I think, a good thing, that people are sending me emails and responding to pieces that I'm writing in public or responding to tweets and asking me how to preach, how to speak in this moment. So that people are willing to engage this is fantastic. And people are feeling the need to speak with meaning into this moment. One of the things that I've been reminding people is that we're talking a lot about myths today that American Christians sort of carry around, a myth of white supremacy that they've activated into a horrible reality, a myth of numbers are better. And there's a myth that goes along with this whole reluctance of political speech. And that is Jesus never talked about politics. Is that you can't talk about politics and religion, and look at Jesus. And that is simply not true. I think there's great room within churches to begin a process of, in white churches, to begin a process of pointing out the fact that Jesus lived in a deeply political context, and that many of the things that we think are not about politics really are in Jesus' conversations and Jesus' sermons, etc. Because, of course, we don't recognize the politics of first century Roman occupation of Palestine. Mm-hmm. we don't recognize that political reality. Instead, what we think about politics is we think about Republicans versus Democrats. We think about the horse race. We think about a presidential election. But we don't think about the fact that Jesus is a subject, a peasant subject to a brutal and violent empire, one of great inequality of wealth and power. And he talks about politics all the time. When he, for example, when he issues a dinner invitation, when he says in Gospel of Luke, hey, when you invite people to dinner, don't invite your friends or your wealthy neighbors, but instead invite the poor and people you don't know and people who are suffering because they cannot repay you. Well, we think, oh, isn't that nice? Jesus is inviting a whole lot of people to dinner. But what he's actually doing right there is he's questioning the entire economic system of the ancient Roman Empire, which was built around the idea of patronage and payback. So if you had a dinner party, what you would do was invite somebody who had money and power. And that way, that person then owed you a debt of gratitude that you could call back that debt at some point in time when it was convenient for you. And so that's just the way the Roman Empire worked, is that rich people scratched the back of other rich people, that people who wanted more power scratched the backs of the powerful. And there was actually an economic and social system that made that a kind of coinage. Dinner invitations were a kind of coinage of the Roman Empire, whereby you could increase your own wealth and power. And so Jesus says to the people who are listening to him, don't do that. Don't participate in that economic system. Don't invite people that could pay you back, but instead invite the poor and the outcast. And it literally says right there in the Gospel of Luke, because they cannot repay you. And what that little story is, just there, it's one example of what Jesus does constantly in the New Testament, is that Jesus should really, for us in the 21st century, it's like literally putting up a neon sign that says Jesus attacks Roman economic system here. This passage right here is Jesus taking down a system of quid pro quo and inequality. And he does that with taxes. He does that when he associates with certain people. And we think it's Jesus being nice, but it's not. This is the stuff that makes the Romans so mad at Jesus that they eventually will kill him. You don't kill somebody because they're being nice about dinner invitations. You kill them because they're offering a political criticism that is stirring up the masses who might revolt against your government. The New Testament is a political document, and that white Christians have muted that and failed to preach that and failed to form their congregations to be able to see the political environment in which the New Testament is written, in which Jesus speaks. That is a failure of teaching people the Bible. And that becomes, if that isn't the work of pastors, I don't know what is. Now, you can do that with some subtlety and finesse and take a lot longer than I just did, but that's the truth of the matter. And that our seminaries have collaborated in giving white churches the tools to cover that up is damning.
Diana, you said something at the start of our conversation that I want to loop back to kind of almost in some ways be our benediction to this conversation, and that is, we've talked about tribalism, we've talked about division, we've talked about the reality of white supremacy even within our church institutions, we've talked about the mythologies that have propped us up, but you also said there's still hope. There's some hope. Robbie and Diana, I would love for you just to end where might, in the midst of all of those things, we find hope in our churches?
Well, I always find hope on the margins. And I mean, I just gave an example of those emails that I'm getting right now from pastors who are telling me things like, my denomination says I'm not supposed to talk about this, but I feel like if I don't talk about it, I'm not being faithful in this moment. Help me, give me tools. And that those cries are coming out of our leadership saying they're unwilling to collaborate with all of these mythologies any longer, and that they want to do something different for their congregations. That gives me incredible hope. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I think that gives me hope, I'm so grateful for my friendship with Robbie. Literally, he's opened so many doors for me in terms of thinking about issues differently, and the research that he's done, I think, in the last decade has been just extraordinary. This work on white supremacy, this is actually one of these other things that gives me hope for all of the problems that we have with this. I'm a little bit older than Robbie. I just turned 61 this year, and growing up and being born in 1959, and I've been in white churches my whole life, and I have never heard the words white supremacy used as much as I have in the last 3 years in congregations that I'm speaking at and congregations where I'm preaching. The questions now come up naturally from congregations, and I don't have to bring the questions up. And it's not every congregation that's brave enough to do this. It's not every congregation it happens in, but really that so many are, and that the questions now are at least out there, and people can say those words, white supremacy, while they're sitting in a pew in a Presbyterian church, and want to be able to understand that. That openness, I think, is utterly remarkable and is due to an enormous amount of great work by pastors, by writers, by people with prophetic voices, by organizations, to really just say this, we can no longer escape this conversation. And then to begin to do amazing things to open people's consciousness about it. So the pastors are breaking rules and just going ahead and trying to be faithful in a moment, even when their institutions are telling them they can't. And that white Christians, at least some percentage of them, are more naturally inclined now to want to engage this conversation about race than they ever have been before, is pretty darn fabulous.
Robbie, do you have any parting words?
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. I'd say so. Yeah, so we're about 10 years apart. I was born in '68, and I can say in my lifetime, I've never seen an opening like this among white Christians to having this conversation. And it is, the can that has just been endlessly kicked down the road, right? We've had all these opportunities for dealing with it, and we just haven't. And I think, it's another you can't manufacture these moments. I think, they are literally like, Kairos moments that erupt from all kinds of social forces, but we're here, we're in it. And I think it's real. I think 20 years from now, we will be talking about 2020 and this moment of racial reckoning we're in. I mean, I don't think it's a blip. I think it's something quite real. And there's an opening that may not be here 5 or 10 years from now, right? To deal with. If we push it back down, it'll come back up, and maybe our kids will have to deal with it, right? But there is, I think, this real moment that's before us is really important. And maybe I'll just wrap with a moment of hope of, I do see it in a couple of places. Just off flag, you can kind of look it up, but I guess flag is maybe a slip, but because one is about the Confederate flag in my home state of Mississippi, that none other than the state arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Mississippi Baptist Convention, one of my former seminary classmates and friends held a press conference. He's the president of the Mississippi Baptist Convention, calling on the governor and the legislature to remove the Confederate battle flag from there. That was, it was unimaginable. 19 years ago, Mississippi had a referendum. There was no white Christian voice anywhere on that referendum. And I got to say, even when I turned the book manuscript in almost exactly a year ago today, I would not have imagined that any white Christian group in Mississippi would have stood up and called for the removal of the Confederate battle flag from our state flag. But it's happened, right? In Richmond, I walked past doing research for the book, these five massive monuments to the Confederacy. The statues at the center of those, 4 of them are gone. And the 5th one's slated for removal, just tied up in legal proceedings over who and when it's going to get removed, but not if it's going to get removed. That again, I wouldn't have thought, so the symbols, I think, are falling first, and we kind of see that as something. The real question is, will we then take that signal and do the deeper work to unpack and to dismantle the theological structures that enabled us to support and put those things up in the first place, right? That's work that still has to be done. And I'll end with some words from James Baldwin that was writing, and this is from The Fire Next Time over 50 years ago, and I just said this, that if we could muster the courage and love to finally tell the truth to one another, just start there. He thought that would be like the first steps, and these are his words, that we could end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world. So for all of us who love to think about America as a shining city on the hill, here's our opportunity, right? It's right here in front of us to kind of claim that sort of patriotism. I think there's no more Christian and patriotic act than ending the presence of white supremacy from our faith in our country.
Can I say one quick word in closing to a particular group of clergy who might be listening? And that is the people who are nearing retirement, sort of the end of the baby boom generation in particular. You all already have your pensions, and you already are on your way toward retirement. That means you're tired if you're a pastor in that situation, but it also means you have nothing to lose. And what I would love to see is that this generation of pastors who is heading towards the end of their careers, you can provide cover for younger generations of pastors to do enormous work. People who do have something to lose, you can make sure that they don't lose those things. You can invest your wisdom of being congregational leaders over the long haul in creating communities of real change. You don't have to pull back your words. You can say whatever you want. And I really just think that this is the time, if you're not out there right now investing the kind of power and activism and wisdom and courage that has marked so much of that particular generation, if you're not investing that in your younger colleagues and in moving your congregations at this moment, I don't know what you're waiting for. And so I really, really, really just urge tired pastors. I know it's been a long haul. You've only got 4, 5, 6 more years left. You can really do this, and you can make a real difference, especially in the lives of the clergy who are coming behind you. And so do that work. And boy, yes, speak truth to be the kind of church that can be in what James Baldwin was describing there, a church that is truthful in a society that is finally speaking the truth.
Diana and Robbie, I just want to say thank you for this very fruitful conversation. I'm going to offer a blessing over you. I'm going to change up a passage of scripture, but how beautiful are the mouths of those that speak good, hard news. And so thank you for calling us to be good truth tellers as pastors and those who are working and operating in faith communities. I want to thank those of you who are watching and also having conversation around this conversation that I've had with Robbie and Diana today. And we hope that you will join us on Thursday as we talk to local pastors who will help us face this preaching moment in a divided culture. And so we'll talk more about what it means to preach in a season like this. And finally, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Amplify Media. We hope that you'll stick around for just a couple of more minutes as they share a bit more about the resources that they provide for churches. But for now, look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thank you again for joining in with us today.